Hey everyone, my name is Madison. I'd like to welcome you to one of our final days of host here. I am pleased to be introducing Jeff Stein, award-winning architect and president of the Cosanti Foundation. Located in central Arizona, the urban laboratory Arcosanti is an ongoing experiment pioneering a new approach to the design of cities. Arcosanti was founded over 40 years ago by the legendary architect Paolo Soleri. It is now under the care of the Cosanti Foundation. Jeff's work at Arcosanti is to integrate architecture and ecology and demonstrate an alternative human habitat. Jeff has served as the dean of the Boston Architectural College and has taught in architecture schools in the U.S., Switzerland, and France. Jeff also writes Architectural Boston Magazine and has been an architecture critic for the New England newspapers Banker and Tradesman. So everyone, thank you, and welcome, Jeff.
Thank you. And thank you all, not only for coming this afternoon, but putting on this whole conference. This Hopes Conference is a really important part of world culture, and not just this week. And I'm really glad to be here, the latest in a long line of people coming to Oregon and Eugene from Arcosanti, which includes Michael McConnell sitting right here from Portland, Oregon, who is also spent some time in Arcosanti, and first-year architecture student Hallie Anderson, who is out here as well. And also Banks Upshaw, who for many years was the chief architect at Cosanti and who also was the campus architect here at the University of Oregon in Eugene. Oregon and Arcosanti like that. Here is a picture of Paolo Soleri, the founder of Arcosanti, really extraordinary architect from Italy and who studied with Frank Lloyd Wright for a couple of years and who died just 1 year ago. And this was his question, and it is the question that Arcosanti raises and does not quite answer yet, as none of us have been able to answer it quite this week. But it is the question that we ask, and it's the question you're going to have to ask during your lives and professional careers too. How shall we live on the earth? It's still a question. Now, clearly, here's one answer. We're going to be living in cities. Over half of us on the planet now live in cities as it goes, and here are some statistics. Since 1970, and we saw a little bit of this in Shenzhen in the previous presentation too, China has urbanized. Its urbanized growth has been 281% over those years. India, Brazil, the USA is just about on this chart as well. Here's the problem, and it isn't really a problem of numbers of humans quite, and it isn't a problem of the numbers of us that want to live in cities. It's the pattern in which we have been making cities. This is pretty typical of not only American cities, but cities in India, Middle East, China, spreading a thin film of life across a great expanse that takes quite a bit of excess land, energy, time, materials to support it all. Here's a famous NASA photograph of Beijing, which, is quite a bit larger than Portland, but really, Portland and Eugene don't look this much different at night. And here we are, Phoenix and Huaji, China. Just because we don't have really good ideas about how to design cities yet in the United States doesn't mean that we aren't exporting these ideas all around the globe. We are still thought leaders in the realm of urban design in the U.S., and that's getting to be a big problem for the rest of the world who'd like to be like us. And as we do, 5% of the world's population consuming a little more than 20% of the Earth's resources. It means that in this era of globalization that we're ensconced in right at this very minute, if everyone in the world were going to live the way we do, those of us in this room, it'd take 4 more Earths to support us all. I've done the math. We don't have 4 more Earths. This is a really interesting issue. So, here's one of the pieces of research that we have come up with at COSANTIC. In any given system, the most complex entity is also the most miniaturized. There's a way that technology has taken advantage of that, and so these things in your pocket, only a generation ago, the computing power invested in one of these would have taken up most of this room. But it doesn't anymore. Complexity, miniaturization. We're looking at biology when we talk about this stuff, though, and we're looking at the biology of evolution and, in fact, what we think of as being sort of the peak of evolution, the human brain. Each one of our brain cells connects directly, synapses, with another 15,000 brain cells packed tightly, compactly, allowing for some complexity on all sides, so that because of this design, it's a really great design, we are now the going thing. We're the dominant species on the planet. This might be a good thing, maybe not, but it's only happened because of this design. Here's another example of that same thing, in a way, at a little bit different scale. I've done some work in the last year with physicists at the Santa Fe Institute, and they are working on the problem of cities as they see it, and the understanding which goes along with the work of Paolo Soleri and the Cosanti Foundation, that cities are the latest organism to inhabit the planet. Cities are organic. They are organisms. And so when you look at other organisms, you see, first of all, that they're contained and they're three-dimensional, and in their design, there are certain efficiencies. The Santa Fe Institute, for instance, has found that an elephant is 10,000 times bigger than a mouse. And yet, the elephant only uses 1,000 times the amount of energy that a mouse does, because it is not 10,000 separate mice, but it's a single, elegantly designed organism. That's what we have in mind for cities. In order for them to be sustainable, to sustain us, it's not good anymore to imagine that they can be 10,000 separate buildings, but rather they ought to be cities, single, elegantly designed organisms. And we have a word for that, arcology, architecture and ecology as two parts of a whole system, not separate entities. Two parts of a single system. Here's some early research on the part of Soleri and some of the people who were working with him at the time, left over from the mid-1950s. Here's a drawing of a building. This is a sectional drawing of a building. And you can see in the upper left-hand corner there are some horizontal lines. Those are floors for inhabitation. The whole building looks like a dish, so that it can have places to collect solar energy. It also collects water. It might even be able to move to follow the sun or rainstorms. It's also meant, there's this little H2O thing here in the middle of the base of it. It's meant to be sited near an ocean so that incoming tides run electrical generators, turbines, as the water comes in, and as the water goes back out, it runs the turbines again. And so here's a building that is possible to produce its own electricity and to have a relation with its surroundings that is a little more interesting than most of the buildings we have going on now. Paolo Soleri graduated from the Torino Politecnico in Turin, Italy, with a doctorate of architecture, which was then and still is the standard professional degree in European architecture schools. And he had in mind to study a little bit at MIT after that and used this drawing and a series of others like it to point out the cosmic potential of architecture. And he had in mind to undertake a PhD study at MIT. And MIT turned him down. They later published his first 2 books, but at this point they said, gee, gasoline is 10 cents a gallon and oil is $1 a barrel, and who cares about this stuff? Nobody. So see you later. That was then. This is now. Here are some other drawings of ways that buildings, entire towns, in fact, could be shaped to shade themselves in summertime from direct sun above our heads to facing south, gain plenty of light and heat in the wintertime as you need it the most. Over a series of projects and several years' time, mostly in the 1960s and 70s, Soleri and the people working with him mined the notion of arcology, 3-dimensional contained cities, and developed a series of different projects that might question the geometry of cities and also their density. But overall, 3-dimensionality didn't mean tightly packed like hotels or high schools, but really 3-dimensional with plenty of space inside the city. And yet the notion here is that a city designed like the rest of organic life on Earth, 3-dimensional, compact, complex, would give its inhabitants the sort of connection to each other and their surroundings that we all really like, would give us the kind of urban intensity that more and more people are seeking, and also allow us to be country people at the same time, be surrounded by the patterns of nature that 10,000 generations of humans have co-evolved with. And now more and more of us are missing. Along the way of the evolution of this idea came this notion, 2 suns arcology. One, the sun in the sky, 96 million miles away, just about the right distance, actually, to be responsible for all of life on Earth and otherwise the evolving consciousness of humankind. Those 2 suns could develop something really interesting. And these are some examples, more sections of an arcology that could be an entire town that could shade itself, gather light and heat in the winter. And there on the left-hand side of the screen, this place is designed to be built on top of a hill facing south, and so solar greenhouses that could recycle organic wastes for soil, produce food for the consumption and powering its citizens, and produce heat energy to power the town itself. Food production right on the doorstep of your own town. Pretty interesting idea. And it happens almost nowhere in America right now. These are a series of models that take advantage of that notion. and other notions like it. There's a sort of a frugality overlaid with this idea of arcology, and here's one example of it. The Glen Canyon Dam, which exists now on the Colorado River above the Grand Canyon, and here's an example of what you could do to that dam by siting a town of 12,000 people on the face of it. Water available for drinking, for recreation, for fish, for food, for irrigating cropland and greenhouses, as well as for generating electricity. Or in this case, an arcology in a very cold climate near Chita, Siberia, a mining town of about 20,000 people with a huge solar greenhouse. There are more examples of this, more questioning of the size and shape that these three-dimensional cities might be able to develop into. And from time to time, we have clients, although we've never built one yet. And here's an idea for how to stretch an arcology. In China, Lean Linear City, we were contacted by Beijing to design a town for about 250,000 people, 50 kilometers west of Beijing. And it's at the end of a railway line. Our idea was, gee, instead of putting it at the end of an hour-long commute, maybe the city could be linear and grow out from Beijing. Here's a section of how it could actually work. It's in a wind corridor. It goes east to west, and so is perfect for solar energy. And this was developed. A series of models were built by a group of Chinese architects and architecture students, and this resulted in a month-long exhibition in Beijing and a series of conferences and lectures and 2 books and nothing more. Among the criticisms were too much democracy. People would be able to meet and greet each other and get together in ways that central governments might not like that well. And the other issue was that China is becoming a car manufacturer. It's pretty much the greatest car manufacturer on the planet right now. Only a generation ago, it was bicycles and, according to us Americans, really romantic, dense cities. And now the Chinese are driving 120 million cars, and they expect to go up to 250 million within the next 10 years. Oh, boy. Well, this all started with the Cosanti Foundation, a made-up word by Paolo Soleri. Cosa and anti, 2 Italian words meaning literally before things. Cosanti Foundation is a place for ideas before things. It's sort of the antithesis of the Nike slogan, just do it. We'd rather just think about it, imagine how it's going to affect several generations out, and what the externalities in our current economy would have to be in order for things to go on, and then maybe do it. It also has to do with architecture in the Frank Lloyd Wright mode. His idea was, of course, that architecture is the mother of all the arts. You want to do something like have dance, you need a dance studio, or symphony, a symphony hall, or a little get-together like this, you need an auditorium. Architecture comes before anything. And being an architect seems only natural, right? So here are some of the early buildings at the Cosanti Foundation in Paradise Valley, Arizona. Experiments, really, about how to live in the Sonoran Desert. Here's a photograph of Paolo Soleri around 1961 hosing off the desert floor. This actually is the floor of the desert at Cosanti, and it's been carved into. This is dirt that has been carved into, wetted, made into this form, and there are these grooves where some steel reinforcement is going to be placed, and then concrete is going to be poured right over the top of this thing. And then what's underneath gets dug out, and that becomes the roof of a building. And the roof then gets earth bermed on top of it, and it's an earth-sheltered studio at Cosanti, and it's still there now, 50 years later, and you could visit it too. Another idea for how buildings might work in the Arizona desert is two roofs. Le Corbusier did this in Zurich, Switzerland, too, in a really wonderful little building. But in Phoenix, Arizona, two roofs really make sense. You can, it's garments. You know, if I were too hot here right now, I would just take this jacket off and maybe my shirt too, because I have a Hopes 20 T-shirt. It'd still be okay. But we don't do that with buildings at all. And so here we are putting on some garments to protect ourselves from the sun in the summertime. We take those things off in the winter, and the sunlight hits the building itself and warms things up. Another example of some of the concrete architecture at a certain small scale, really. It's pretty intimate at Cosanti. This is a ceramic studio next to an office. We're looking at the wall of that office, and here's what's on the inside of that little building. On the left is north. That's sort of a half-shell structure, concrete structure that is earth-bermed. And then on the south, it's a canvas lid. So in the wintertime, the sun shines through there, warms things up. In the summertime, there are bamboo shades that go over the canvas, and so things stay pretty cool. And right along the top, where there's a fluorescent tube above that, initially in the concrete was this little tube that sprayed water onto the canvas, so that the canvas would cool itself and that water vapor would find its way in, and it's kind of an evaporative cooling solution to that place. Here's another ornamental structure almost. It's a canopy over the shallow end of the swimming pool at Cosanti. This was constructed before the swimming pool was there. These 12 telephone poles, 3 in each corner, were placed into the ground on great footings, and then a low mound of dirt was piled up, packed down, as we saw before, carved into a little bit for design and structural reasons, and then concrete was poured on top of it, was allowed to cure for whatever that is, 28 days, and then a crane came in and lifted it up to the top of these poles where it sits, 20 tons of concrete over everybody's head. It's a big heat sink, so that in the summertime, that overhead sun is shining down on here. The shade that results keeps that shallow end of the pool fairly cool, so it's comfortable to be out there during the day. But in the evening time, there's not much water vapor in the desert air here, and so the air gets cool at night, and this big concrete structure loses its heat, much of it wasted up into the sky, but other bits of it is radiated down, and so you can be out on the pool in a really comfortable, lovable situation day and night, year-round, because, of course, in the wintertime, when the sun's down by the southern horizon coming this way, it shines all the way in there and warms everything up. Another piece of architectural activity at Cosanti Foundation, this case, there was a tree there already. Doesn't mean you have to cut the tree down. It means you can build around it. And in this case, it's a deciduous tree, and so in the summertime it shades the building that has been built around it. and in the wintertime it drops its leaves and the sun shines right through. Things change at Arcosanti, begun in 1970 as a kind of an urban laboratory. That's a term that the architecture critic Ada Louise Huxtable gave to the place. Solari is building out in Arizona, 70 miles north of Phoenix, a kind of urban laboratory. And we all thought, yeah, that's what this is. It is an urban laboratory to test some things. Architecture, part of that, but the socialization, the connection that comes from a certain kind of architecture really is the test. This is Arcosanti in its village condition, which is about right now, a series of prototype buildings that are meant to connect people to each other, to their work, to the landscape itself, and to the rest of the world, which they do pretty interestingly. They also have been built using some sort of third world techniques, and also built by a cadre of volunteers, people who actually pay a tuition to come to construction workshops. This has been the thread that has connected 1970 to 2014. There are still construction workshops at Arcosanti now, 5-week workshops, and people from all over the world continue to come to that place to participate in its construction and learn about what has gone forward. Built mostly of concrete for a whole bunch of interesting reasons, among which is that absolute amateurs can work with concrete in really positive and powerful ways. And if we were to go with that sort of cultural scam that is LEED, L-E-E-D, we would be LEED gold for sure, because the concrete is coming from a concrete cement plant mined only about 20 miles away. The sand comes from the site itself, and the formwork, of course, is earth from the site. You know, in building concrete buildings, most of the time, about 50% of the cost of the building is the formwork itself, which until only lately never got reused. Now it's made out of stainless steel oftentimes, and it does get reused, but it means the formwork is even more expensive than it used to be. So here's concrete formwork that is silt. It's earth from the site itself, and it is piled up, packed down, carved into. Concrete is placed directly on it. Here's a picture of 85-year-old Paolo Solari troweling some concrete into some architecture there. Concrete pigment can be placed on the earthen formwork, and as a result, coloration can happen. And you get things like this. This is a huge vaulted arch. There are a couple of them right at the very center of Arcosanti, and these were the things that were constructed first. The first stuff to be built at Arcosanti was public space, not classrooms or apartments or businesses or stores or shops, but the covering of public space. Here's how it was built. Some of the stuff cast in place, and then the rest of the panels cast on the desert floor and lifted into place with a crane. And here's how Arcosanti started. It's not like building a new subdivision at the edge of Eugene, where you can hook into the water supply and the sewer lines and hook up that electrical situation and some gas pipes. This is out in central Arizona, a couple miles off Interstate 17 on the top of a mesa. We're not the first persons to inhabit this place. There are petroglyphs and Pueblo ruins on the landscape itself. Cosanti Foundation owns 860 acres there and leases another 3,200. So We have a 4,000-acre land preserve on which we are building only on 15 acres on the top of this particular mesa, but here was the beginning of it, the start of some public space that ends up looking like this when it's empty, and this when things are happening in it. There's a terrific series of performing arts events that go on at Arcosanti all year round, and this is a group, a pyrotechnic theater troupe called Flam Chen from Tucson. Some of them used to be part of Cirque du Soleil, but Cirque du Soleil wasn't dangerous enough for them, apparently, and so they broke off, and now they live in Tucson and perform at Arcosanti every so often. Or here, Dinner for 200 under the vaulted arches, which not only shade the place from some sun, but they direct views to the surrounding landscape, too. And here's a balcony on part of an apartment building that's next to this vault, and the balcony is also a roof scupper. We harvest rainwater, because there's not very much of it, until the drought started. We're in the midst of a 30-year drought in Arizona and the American Southwest generally. We're in the 12th year of it. Before then, we were getting about 15 inches of rain a year at Arcosanti. It falls on the building tops and into this sort of a scupper. There are several of these around, and they drain into cisterns, and we use that water for landscape watering. You know, there are ways that architecture relates to, like humans, to the ground. There's this base, there's a great middle, and there's a top that relates to the sky. And so on some of these buildings, there are some ornaments that draw your eye up so that you do relate to the sky. In this case, we've been looking at the top of a ceramic studio. Here's an interesting thing about Paolo Soleri and a way that he might be a model for you once you graduate into a really crummy economy in this country. And that is, just because you're educated as an architect doesn't mean you have to earn your living as one. It means you're thoughtful and trained to think things through in a three-dimensional way. You know how to make things, and buildings aren't the only things you know how to make. Among Paolo Soleri's first commissions as an architect in Italy was a terrific ceramics factory. And it still exists in Vietri in southern Italy, and it's still a ceramics factory. And in making that building, he learned the ceramics trade as well, the craft of it. And so in Arizona, some of his first work was remembering that craft and how to make ceramic instruments, tools. This is a tray of dirt, earth, and it has been carved into to make molds for ceramic wind bells. It's earth, you dig a hole in it, and you pour that full of slip, which is a ceramic material about the consistency of pancake batter. It begins to dry from the outside first, and when it gets thick enough, you can dip the rest of it out and let this stuff dry, and the result is this. And of course, the clay also comes from Arizona, from Globe, Arizona, not too far away from us. And so we're making art objects out of dirt. And of course, unless you drop them on the concrete floor, they last forever too. So wind bells, an interesting way to support the beginnings of a career in architectural research. So Soleri took that idea, the technology of making these ceramic bells, and translated it into making buildings. But instead of digging a hole for the building, you pile the earth up, carve into it. You might place precast concrete elements in it, and eventually pour concrete on it. Looks like that from the back. And this from the front. A ceramic studio in the shape of an apse, a quarter of a sphere that, again, shades itself in the summertime, gathers light and heat from the low winter sun. You probably know by now from going to architecture school that if you have a design solution, it can't solve just one problem. You have to solve at least 2 or 3 problems, or it's just not worth having come up with that solution. And so this shape is good for energy on the one hand, but it's also really great for socialization. The people who are working in this apse, there are half a dozen of them making ceramic bells and tools on a daily basis, get to see each other, they get to hear each other, they get to be able to talk and see each other's work, and the socialization involved with this is really great. It's a great place to work. There's also a temporary stage that can happen that covers the central workspace, and so the entire building, after hours, can become a performing arts little amphitheater for chamber music or lectures. And here's another thing. Lou Kahn, in the 1950s, 20th century American architect from Philadelphia, said, "The urban street is the city's living room. It's a place where a young boy," and it was the 50s, so it was always a young boy in the 50s, though now girls can do this too, can walk down the street and find out what it is that he wants to do for the rest of his life. That was a really romantic notion that Lou Kahn brought up, and it probably worked in the Renaissance, but not since then, and certainly not any streets that you and I know of, which are filled with carbon monoxide and noisy, dangerous cars. You don't want your young boy near that stuff. But at Arcosanti, which is a walkable town at this point, and is meant to continue to be that, people walk past this and they can see what's going on. It's open to the public. In fact, it really connects. It's an educational building because of the form that it has. And it turns out, really, that that's how architecture can connect people inside to outside. The way you connect through architecture is you just don't build the fourth wall. And in that particular climate, central Arizona, it's possible to get by with that kind of stuff too. There's a 30-degree temperature difference between being in the shade and in the sun at this place, and so it's that much warmer in the wintertime than the ambient outside air, that much cooler in the summertime. Plus, if it gets too hot, you take off a few clothes. That's just how life is at Arcosanti. Another version of this same apse shape, though this one with a little added complexity, is this bronze foundry. What we're looking at now is the inside of an apse. Down below are some very shallow studios that are part of the foundry, and above are windows that are looking into 2-story apartments that surround the building, on the north side especially, so people can live and work in the same building. You know, the average American, not just in Eugene or Portland or Bozeman, Montana, but all across the country, averagely we drive half an hour a day to our work or school and another half an hour back. You can worry about the XL pipeline as much as you want, but if your job is half an hour away, you're going to continue to be driving for quite some time to come. But there's a way that architecture can become a little more complex. People can live and work in the same place and produce things like this, bronze wind bells, famous Solari bells that are sold in stores and shops around the U.S. and in some other places and online. These are sold online. Well, here's the view from the foundry floor. If you ever thought you wanted to work in a bronze foundry, this is probably the one you want to work in. And another view of a part of it. And then there's this model. The next step at Arcosanti was to build, and this is the great thing about that place, we're making things. We're building buildings continuously. And this was meant to be the East Crescent, a crescent-shaped integral urban neighborhood that instead of packing houses right up against those old streets, carbon monoxide and car-filled and noisy streets, the houses and some institutional spaces are packed around the back wall of a performing arts amphitheater, in which private space then begins to define the edge of public space. Here was the first bit of construction of that piece, beginning of putting some seats in and the back walls of some of the apartments. The seats have integral concrete pigment, and there are chairs that sit on these things too. And ultimately, that's what it looks like. Apartments, and also some dormitories and a library and some other spaces for our own students that are surrounding a performing arts center. So we've gone from just public space to an apps that works with energy and the public and work, to an apps that has living spaces around it, to now an integral urban neighborhood where about 40 people live at this moment and has seating for 300. And so here are some other views of the construction of Arcosanti so far. This is a little bit of a photo of my apartment. I live in around 600 square feet at this place, and yet have all kinds of outdoor space. I'm on the edge of this performing arts amphitheater, and this solar greenhouse that you're looking at on the right-hand side of your screen is my furnace. It's the heating source for my apartment and for much else of the East Crescent there as well. Also, it's the tomato source, of course. And so this is a model of what Arcosanti is intended to become over the next generation or so. A town for between 3,000 and 5,000 people. The dark gray pieces are what have been built so far, kind of a base camp for arcology in the central Arizona desert. We've built some things, we've learned from them, we continue to complexify, and we go right on. And then the lighter colored stuff is the town structure itself, about 20 stories tall. On the top of this mesa, down at the bottom of the slide, a series of large solar greenhouses that are meant to produce heat and food and recycle organic wastes as part of the ecology of the city itself. The whole city is shaped so that it shades itself in summer, gathers light and heat as it faces south in winter. There are some round pieces at Arcosanti, in part because even though plywood comes in 4x8 rectangles, almost nothing else out there in the natural world is rectangular. Everything's round. We're on a round planet in a round solar system in a universe that appears to be round too. And so as you look to the horizon through these round openings, it sort of connects you subconsciously to your surroundings. Well, so, and this is a view from my apartment with the very computer on which I was sorting these slides just the other day on the desk. Only lately, a film crew from Canadian television was at Arcosanti. We get about 50,000 visitors a year at this place, and many of them are TV, film crews, magazine journalists, online people who are looking for some solutions. Everybody's worried, and for good reason too. And so there are people who think Arcosanti might have something to offer, might have some relevance to answer that question, how shall we live? Because it's not just us or architects who are asking this question. So Canadian television is doing a series on nature deficit disorder, which apparently is a real thing with young children who are, for the most part, living inside buildings with four walls and a floor and a roof and looking into computer screens for their early parts of their childhood. And as a result, have all sorts of really interesting little disabilities and personality quirks, not being a part of surrounding natural landscape patterns which we've all co-evolved with. And so this film crew imagined that Arcosanti might have something to say about that, and indeed it does. It's arcology, architecture and ecology, as Paolo Soleri began to imagine it a half-century ago, and as it continues today, admits that we are part of the life of the earth, that our culture, built culture especially, can be coherent with nature, and like nature, like all life, our buildings, our cities must be both miniaturized and complex. They have to do more than keep the rain out, more than garage a series of segregated activities and people. This was the idea in 1970 when this project was started, and it continues to draw people and attention to this place. Here's the idea. Let's make our buildings, our cities, grow food, generate energy. Let's design them to recycle waste. Let's make them in a way that allows us to be together face to face, not just back to back. Let's not make them dull. Let's make them support life. Let's make them extraordinary in the way they allow us to confront each other and the cosmos, and let's see what happens then. That's what I wanted to tell you.
I can bring the microphone if we need it.
That's a quick question. That last model you were showing, where you had the dark zones of the projects that have been built
yes.
and other future expansions, it seems like you're about to make a huge shift in scale.
Yes, they are.
How are you planning to address that, considering your technique of construction is relying on unskilled volunteers?
It's the great question that we have, and the thing that, in fact, Paolo Soleri's death is allowing us to do, frankly. It always occurs when the charismatic leader of some place retires or dies that there's a little bit of scramble to figure out what exactly were the important parts of his idea and what he might have been standing in the way of, and what things open up now that a new generation is taking over. You'll find this in all sorts of places that you yourselves experience too. And so for Soleri, it was for his lifetime his idea that he would actually take part in the craft of making these buildings. And in fact, one of the reasons why that East Crescent neighborhood is 3 stories tall instead of 12 stories tall is that he had limitations, and they were at the 3-story level. Now, here's another interesting issue about Arcosanti, and that is that it has bootstrapped itself so far. It hasn't taken advantage of any government grants, because you may understand that the government is behind suburbanization since World War II, and this stands in the way of it, and it isn't sort of in the government or big oil's interest in conserving land and energy and materials in the way that this project promises to do that. And anyway, so we haven't had grants from Warren Buffett, who, by the way, now owns a railroad that is taking coal from Wyoming to eastern seaports to ship to China. Because the coal has too much carbon in it, it is too dirty to burn in America from Wyoming, but we can burn it in China. But when it does get burned in China, of course, those are the heavy metals that you can measure in Eugene when it rains, because that stuff just keeps coming back. There is no away. You want to throw something away? There is no away. Everything is connected. Anyway, so we haven't had grants or outside investment in Arcosanti either. And so now the board of the Cosanti Foundation, along with a group of some alumni who have, after doing workshops at Arcosanti, gone on to really interesting careers in urban planning around the country, have come together to do some strategic planning about Arcosanti, about what the next big thing is there, and how it can be funded by investment and actual return on investment. So there gets to be a way that Arcosanti is about to become more relevant to some more people in that regard. So yes, it's a change in how things have happened so far, but we're still building on what has gone before, and we hope not to change much the nature of that place. Yes?
So I guess my question is a little bit related to that, but I was wondering, since Arcosanti is so focused on experimentation, how you guys fail, and do you fail sustainably? Because that pretty much comes along with experimentation, is this idea of failing a lot until you get it right. So.
Oh yeah, so if I understand it, the question is, what are the good examples of how we have failed at Arcosanti and gone right on to continue?
But also failing sustainably,
Right, failing sustainably. That's exactly what you would like to do. And it's probably the best that you can do, too, since none of us have any real idea what the hell we're doing on this planet anyway. And so it's all conjecture. There's not a future. There's something we can plan for and try to build. And if the tsunami doesn't come and wipe it out, that could be really good too. But there's this other stuff. And so, yes, so how have we failed sustainably? One way is that we have started small and remained small, and done some very small projects, like we made a road into the site. There wasn't a road there in 1970 when things started to happen, and so that road was graded with a bulldozer, and some gravel was put down on it, and not a lot of investment has happened since then, and so it's still this gravel road, 2.5 miles long. It hasn't been paved. It's not great for tour buses. It's fine if you have a rental car, by the way, but if you actually own your own car, it's a little bumpy as well. And that sort of thing prevents the faint of heart from actually visiting Arcosanti. As I mentioned, we have about 50,000 visitors a year, which sounds pretty good, actually, and people pay and they go on tours and buy bells and talk to us, and it's a pretty interesting place as a result of that. The Grand Canyon, that has paved roads, has 3 million visitors a year just up the road a little bit from us, and so we've failed to capture some of the public's imagination because they just can't get there on that road. On the other hand, we haven't put down a lot of oil on the ground. I mean, really, America uses about 20 million barrels of oil a year, and has pretty regularly for the last 20 years at least, to create asphalt for roads, streets, parking lots. This is great. In order to make wheeled vehicles go really comfortably, you just put down oil on the ground, and there you go. It's smooth, it's lovely, and nothing grows, and it off-gases, and it's totally poisonous, and yet we use it that way. So we haven't used it that way at Arcosanti, and so there's a little bit of a barrier to tourism, and yet it's a sustainable barrier. And so we've been asked by the county to upgrade these days, and we are putting some more gravel on it and bringing it up to some standards, but we're not going to pave it right away. It'll be smoother, it'll be more workable, but still sustainable. It's that way about some other pieces of infrastructure at Arcosanti, too. We have an oxidation pond, which is the sewage treatment plant for us, in which if you flush a toilet, or we have a little bit of gray water systems going on, but if water goes down a drain, it goes down to the end of a pipe and into a little pond that is filled with aerobic and anaerobic bacteria, and some of it sinks down and filters through ground to the aquifer below us, and the rest evaporates off, and it's great, but it isn't going to last much longer because we're at the sort of upper level of the number of people who can use it and in its location, too. So we're thinking far enough ahead for that kind of infrastructure. And there are a few things like that that have happened. Also, here's a way to deal with sustainability, and it's the way we have done it at Arcosanti, too, which is you build the sort of most interesting space. You enclose the most interesting space that you can, make the most interesting architecture possible, and then after you've started to live in it for a few years, you retrofit it for all sorts of things, which could be insulation and different materials, ways of getting rain off of it and harvesting that, or ways that the sun can heat it. Architecture, in the profession of architecture, it's pretty much a one-shot deal. You design the building, it gets built, you go on to the next thing. But if you're actually living in the building that you've designed, it's a kind of an evolution. There are all sorts of ways that the building can change to become even more sustainable than you thought about it in the first place. It's not just maintenance, but it really is transformation, which, by the way, is what this place, Arcosanti, is about. There are people who imagine that Paolo Soleri is kind of the grandfather of the sustainability movement, but not really. He's not about sustainability, whatever that means. He's more about transformation. His idea isn't to sustain Phoenix, Arizona, the way it is, 900 square miles, 60% of which is covered with roads and cars and parking lots, automobile-related media, and in which 4.5 million people spend about $13 billion a year on cars, according to the American Automobile Association. Can't live in Phoenix without a car, but $13 billion just to go to the grocery store or to school or to soccer practice. This is a little troubling. It's a huge transfer of wealth from almost every citizen to a few car companies. And this is, by the way, just cars, too, and insurance and maintenance on cars. It's not buying gasoline, which is another $10 to $12 billion a year. And it's not building roads either, which, are $1 million a mile. So the notion of developing arcology, walking cities, three-dimensional pedestrian places, really, we're really built for that as humans. The golden mean proportion, 1 to 1.6, it's legs versus trunk. We're really built to walk around in cities, and it turns out our tax structure would be a lot more interesting if we had more walkable cities too, because of course right now the whole defense posture of this country and many others is how to keep oil coming so that we can drive our cars around cities, which is where mostly we drive cars. 70% of car trips are 30 miles or less, and they're within city limits, not going across country. If you're going across country, go ahead. But worse than that, interestingly, is this notion of 10,000 separate buildings. You know, in America, only a few years ago, Arianna Huffington had a great protest movement against SUVs. And there were people out in used car lots with big signs saying, "What would Jesus drive?" Well, it doesn't matter what he drives, actually, as long as he doesn't drive it to church. Because it's buildings where all of the energy is used in this country. About a quarter of the energy used in America, as you probably know, goes to transportation. Cars, boats, planes, motorcycles, commercial jetliners, the whole thing. Only a quarter. Another quarter goes to manufacturing, because most of our manufacturing happens in other countries. We offshored it for just that reason. You know, computers. We don't want to make computers in this country. It's the dirtiest industry ever imagined by humans. It's really funny to me when at the bottom of something that comes via email it says, "Think twice before printing this out." Hey, you should have thought twice before buying a computer, which is poisoning all of the water in China, where all of the computers are made. We design a few of them here, but they're all, no matter what brand, manufactured in China because we don't want anything to do with that stuff. Anyway, that's about half the energy used, and the other half is used to heat and cool and light our buildings, like this one. It's not that bad outside right now, although we might want to wear a jacket if we were out there, but there's light, and yet here we are, floor walls, roof, ceiling. The only air that we're getting is coming through a machine, and we're burning some nice electric lights, and we're talking about sustainability. Great. There's a long way to go for us to be able to change enough that we're really going to be a part of the ecology of the planet. But we think this work at Arcosanti, as small as it is, as crude as it is nudging reality just a little bit to push us in the direction of real coherence. We hope so.
You have one more question? Oh, two more. Let's do that.
So, how is current projections about the state of the Great Southwest drought, which are different from what they were projecting 40 years ago, how is that impacting your planning?
Yeah, current projections for state of the Great Southwest drought. Well, we're in, as I mentioned in an earlier panel, we're in the 12th year of a 30-year drought. Most climate scientists imagine that that's what's happening in the American Southwest, and we really feel it as well. The last time that happened was in the 1400s in that area of the world, and at that time, everybody who was living there left, moved up to Colorado, up to the mountains, or over to the Midwest or someplace where there was some water and a little less heat. So Arcosanti is at 3,700 feet in elevation, a little bit temperate on the northern sort of edge, high grassland part of the Sonoran Desert, and we sit on an aquifer. And so at this point, we have 3 wells on the site. The deepest is 60 feet, whereas in Phoenix, the average well depth is 1,700 feet because they've mined the groundwater, and it's getting to be less and less. We use very little water. We mine rainwater such as it is for landscape watering. We don't have a car wash, and we have low flush toilets, and they're not composting toilets because that's a problem for our county supervisors, as it is for counties all over the country so far. And otherwise, we're very aware of how much water we use and try to use as little as possible. But there's growth in central Arizona. You know, when I go back to the East Coast, which is actually fairly regularly, there are real adults there who sidle up to me and say, well, What do you think? Is it still possible to buy land in Arizona? Can I afford it? Because in Boston or Washington, D.C. or Miami, they're all worried about being flooded out in the next generation, and they think it might be a good bet to do something in the Southwest. And while that's pretty funny, really, people worry about that sort of stuff. And so there's continued growth in the state of Arizona. More and more people are moving in, making more and more demands on water. And while the Colorado River actually goes through Arizona and borders it on its western edge, California has the water rights to all of that water. And there have, in years long time past, been clashes of National Guard troops over water rights between those two states, and there are likely to be a few more. But anyway, there is a movement to the north from Tucson and Phoenix, even right now, because it's getting so hot there in the summertime. And part of that is the plan of the Arizona Department of Transportation, in which they're doing more interchanges to make more land available for populations in central and northern Arizona on the interstate highways. And of course, you've maybe heard that the big Eisenhower interstate highway plan has to be completed, and the last little chunk of it is in Arizona that goes from Phoenix up to Las Vegas. And so they're trying to get that funded through the U.S. Congress. But so there's tremendous development pressure in and around Arizona, and yet fewer and fewer resources. The town of Prescott, Arizona, which is 30 miles away from us, has purchased and pirated water rights from the Chino Valley north of it, which is watered by the Verde River. This is more detail than you wanted to know, right? But the Verde River is this wonderful surface water. You know, there are rivers in Arizona, and they're mostly underground. You don't get to, like, water ski on them or anything. And yet this one is going to be drawn down just as Prescott continues to sprawl. And so there are issues about how water is used and how what we think is our water on our property is going to be used, because, of course, water isn't just there. It flows, and it flows from places, and if people are using it all upstream, then there's less to be used downstream. And as I mentioned, everything is connected, and we're just part of it. So we're trying to be a good neighbor to a whole bunch of people in Arizona and talk to them and others about issues like water and the drought that we're in the middle of, and how to live in the desert with that stuff instead of in spite of it. To really be a part of the place where you're growing.
So I visited Arcosante about, 2 years ago? And really enjoyed getting a chance to see the place and see the experiment in action. And one of the initial thoughts that came to my mind is the challenge of building a community that's really quite isolated. And, as you say, there's about 40 people or so living there. It seems that the economic sustenance is largely the tourist service that it provides. And I'm curious, as you transition in your thinking, or carrying the model logically forward to say, okay, we're looking at a population of thousands of people, how do you imagine that being a sustainable economic situation, given its sort of remote location and the challenge of interfacing with other communities and other forms of trade and that kind of a relationship? I'm quite curious from a sustainable economics point of view how you envision that happening.
There are a couple ways to deal with that. One of them is the possibility of changing classical economics to take advantage of the externalities both before and after the manufacture of consumer products that current economics doesn't take into account. And so the economics of cities like Phoenix or Tucson or even Flagstaff don't account for all sorts of waste that happens that nobody's paying for yet, and the difficulty of mining materials that nobody really pays for to begin with either. And so once more and more people begin to be charged the actual cost of living in a Phoenix or a Tucson, then the projects like Arcosanti, no matter how distant, start to become pretty interesting looking through an ecological economics, not environmental economics, by the way, which is another way of monetarizing other pieces of the living biosphere. But otherwise, it's not that distant from anybody. It's about an hour from Phoenix, an hour from Flagstaff, half an hour from Prescott. There is a private airport nearby. There are ways to get to it, certainly. There are ways that we are saving water through the development of solar greenhouses right now to grow food. And in fact, as a result of that, we're beginning to be a food resource for the region. Otherwise, it's the Sonoran Desert, and we get our food same place you do, from Southern California or from Mexico or Chile or someplace else. And so agriculture, greenhouse agriculture, urban greenhouse agriculture is part of it. And the notion of being part of that particular landscape and bringing businesses to it, it used to be, if you didn't live in New York in America, then you didn't live in New York. And that was too bad, because that's where everything was happening. But now you can do pretty much any job you can think of anywhere you want, distant, remotely, via computer. And so we have people at Arcosanti now who are consultants to companies elsewhere and are there because they want to be. Ultimately, sustainability doesn't depend on efficiency, I would say, or energy production, but it depends on lovability. Lovable places are places that humans are going to sustain and that sustain people as well. And Arcosanti so far is one of those places. The fact that it has been built by people who haven't made a dime off of building it so far has been pretty interesting. And the fact that they've been workshop participants, there have been 7,000 of them. 7,000 people since 1970 have participated in the construction of that place. And I knew a whole bunch of them. I know who built my apartment, who did the plumbing on it, and who placed that skylight in the cafe above part of a more complex and interesting building that we didn't actually look at much at Arcosanti. And so there's that connection to people who built it, and those people are continuing to be interested in the place, and many of them are getting to be retirement age too. And so there's a way that they might start their second careers at Arcosanti as citizens of that place. By the way, this is something you're going to have to deal with too. Not only are there going to be plenty of natural disasters for you to deal with, but your parents' generation, the largest generation in the history of the planet, are going to retire, and they're not going to be able to drive their car to the grocery store anymore. So there's some architecture that needs work. Really, there's plenty of work for you to do, and I'm glad to see you at this conference and part of the University of Oregon getting trained to do it. Good. Thank you. Take a break.